Hello and welcome to Unscripted. I'm Kavit Hawaii. In today's program, we will be talking to Peter Kuznick. He's an associate professor of history, director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University in Washington, D.C. He was also the co-author of a joint project with U.S. Director Oliver Stone, The Untold History of the United States. Peter Kuznick, welcome to Unscripted.
Glad to be with you, but I have to make one correction.
Go ahead.
I've been a full professor for a long time.
A full professor. Thank you for the correction. We'll make sure to put that into the intro when it goes on our website page. I was going to jump right in and talk about Hamas with you, but I couldn't help but notice the book behind you, The Untold History of the United States, and that's something I guess I'm going to start out with. And I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about this. I think it's a joint project that you had with Oliver Stone, if I'm not mistaken. And what stands out for me is how you have said that the notion of the U.S. perpetually being the good guys going around spreading freedom is not really the case, although the U.S. has done some fine things, but you also have said the U.S. has done a lot of very bad things. Maybe you could tell us what was the incentive for you to actually come up with this joint project with Oliver Stone and why you were compelled to do it in the first place.
Well, Oliver and I met 29 years ago in 1996. So we've been friends for a long time. And he came into my class for the first time back then. And we discussed at that point doing a feature film together. That has never actually materialized, although we've got a great script for one. But back in 2007, when he was scouting locations in DC for his film Pinkville about the My Lai massacre, we had dinner and he proposed doing a documentary together. It was going to be a 1-hour documentary. But when I went to see him in New York to discuss it 2 weeks later, he had an idea for a 10-hour, 10-part documentary film series. It ended up being 12 hours and 12 parts, and we added several books in addition. So it's a history of the American empire and the national security state. So it's a critique of American exceptionalism, a critique of this idea that the United States is God's gift to humanity, that we're the only civilizing force, and that we're different from all other countries because other countries are motivated by greed or territorial aggrandizement or geopolitics, but the United States only wants to spread freedom and democracy around the world. So we wanted to critique that idea.
I think, I'm sorry to jump in. I'm going to actually ask you and challenge you on this the spread of freedom, of democracy. And the challenging part is what I was going to start this interview with, and that is what Trump has, the U.S. President Donald Trump has leveled in terms of a threat against Hamas, of which he has said this is last warning to Hamas. I'm sure you're familiar with Hamas, the resistance group, in terms of releasing all the captives, and it has held direct talks. And some of the things that Trump has said, make a smart decision, release the captives now or there will be hell to pay later, and even to the Palestinians, saying a beautiful future awaits you, but not if you hold captives. If you do, you are dead. This notion of freedom of democracy in terms of how the U.S. president, along, I must say, with the Israeli prime minister, want to displace forcibly the Palestinians, doesn't go together. Is this something you agree with, and is this one good example, perhaps, of some of the motives behind and the themes behind your book, maybe?
Well, it certainly represents the worst side of American foreign policy. And this is bipartisan. We saw this under the Biden administration when Biden provided massive amounts of military and other aid to Israel. In the aftermath, Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th was brutal, unconscionable in many ways. But the Israeli response has been so excessive that it's shocked the world. Whether we consider it genocide or simply brutality, it's been horrific. And the images coming out As you know, Israel has leveled Gaza, destroyed most of the housing, leveled most of the buildings, and the images of babies being pulled out of the rubble, dead babies, and women and children has shocked the world. So the fact that Biden refused to put any limits effectively on what Israel was getting from the United States or to cut off U.S. military aid for Israel, to Biden's credit, he at least stopped giving Israel 2,000-pound bombs that it was using. And Trump gets in there, and Trump was even bloodier and more brutal when it comes to Israel and Gaza. So Trump gave Israel the 2,000-pound bombs that Biden had stopped giving Israel. And Trump wants to remove all the Palestinians from Gaza and then rebuild it as a special beachfront properties. Trump, idiot, and his idea has been laughed at by people all over the world. But Egypt just came up with its own plan just yesterday, $53 billion reconstruction plan over 4 years. That's a lot more viable than the plan that Trump and his son-in-law they came up with.
Yeah, but it's something that the U.S. has now rejected. I mean, they came up with quite a hefty sum, $53 billion, I believe, is the figure. And of course, it's going to require some Saudi and UAE money to go into that as major contributors. But the U.S. has rejected that. The role of the U.S. when it comes to the Palestinians has been a dubious one. Tell us what you think about the fact that you have the U.S. playing the mediator role all these years, and at the same time, if I was to take a look at the way that Israel has chewed away at Palestinians in terms of their rights, in terms of their land, in terms of other core issues that exist in this conflict, would you analyze the U.S. role as one that was impartial when it came to these talks, which now is not even in the picture any longer because we have gone to another level?
Well, Israel has always been an important part of U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. has seen Israel as, in many ways, its leading outpost in the Middle East. While the United States has developed positive relations with Saudi Arabia and other countries over the years, Israel is really the key militarily to U.S. domination in the region. And Israel has gone from being a progressive country to becoming an extreme right-wing country. What Netanyahu represents now is in many ways a very, very anti-democratic and anti-humane leader in the Middle East. He's very extreme, but there are even more extreme people in his cabinet than he is. And so they are so hostile to the Palestinians, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, and hostile to Iran, of course. Most people around the world have been appalled by what Israel has done. First, in terms of denying rights to the Palestinians, then bombing and leveling Gaza, expanding in the West Bank, and now denying humanitarian aid inside Gaza.
Sure.
Israel's policy has been barbaric in the region, and the Netanyahu government seems like a form of Israeli fascism. The extreme right-wing, anti-humanitarian policies are shocking.
Indeed. Well, when you put that together with what you said, that Israel is key to the U.S. domination in the Middle East, we call it the West Asia region. I'm curious as to why there needs to be a U.S. domination in the West Asia region in the first place. What purpose does the U.S. have in its role in the different scenarios that it has been involved with overall in West Asia before we get into some of the details in terms of what the U.S. has done in the region?
The U.S. has long thought in geopolitical terms that the region is essential because it contains oil. And in the old economies, and still today, oil is a crucial commodity. So when Roosevelt divided it up with the British and the Saudis years ago and said that, Saudi oil goes to the United States, Iranian oil goes to Britain, and we divided up the rest of it between us, the U.S. had this vision that controlling Southwest Asia, as you call it, or the U.S. called it the Middle East, and the British called it the Middle East, really, that region was crucial to U.S. domination and hegemony in the post-war world. So as the Cold War evolved, U.S. saw that region as essential for its strength and domination. And
Okay. Let's put that into context.
US hegemony.
I'm sorry to have interrupted you there. Let's put that into context in terms of arms. I'd like to throw out this piece of stat for you that through 2019 through 2023, the largest share of U.S. arms export was actually to the West Asia region, 38% of it. Arms importer, the largest one was Saudi Arabia. Why is it that you have that happening? Why would the arms be channeled into this area where obviously one of the consequences, if you agree, is the different war scenarios that have erupted, which basically has contributed to the instability? Is it just because of the resources, or is it because, as you said, that the U.S. wants to have domination in this region?
Well, the United States wants to have domination in all regions. If you go back to the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Charles Krauthammer, leading neoconservative theorist, said that this is America's unipolar moment, that it'll last 30 or 40 years, that nobody can challenge the United States for domination in any part of the globe. Then in 2002, after the invasion of Iraq, Krauthammer revisited it and said his view back in 1990 was too limited. It's not the unipolar moment, it's the unipolar era, and it's going to last indefinitely. So that was the vision. Then all the neoconservatives came out of the woodwork and started proclaiming American empire. The New York Times on January 5th, 2003, headlined its Sunday magazine, American Empire, Get Used to It. And that was the vision that the neocons were proposing at that point. They want the domination of the entire planet. However, things went awry, as we know, in Afghanistan and Iraq. And even Krauthammer, in 2006, says America's unipolar moment has passed its apogee. So we were in a state of decline at that point in terms of American domination in much of the world. However, the United States has not given up on that. However, the United States strategy beginning in 2011 was for an Asia pivot. It was to pivot away from the Middle East. As Hillary Clinton lays out in her article, America's Pacific Century, in late 2011, it says the U.S. has to pivot away from the Middle East and Europe and begin focusing on Asia, especially China. And so the U.S. has shifted a lot of its military resources, and the real goal during the Biden administration and the Trump administration is really China, even more than the Middle East and Europe at this point, seeing China as representing more than 50% of global GDP and the area where the future battles are likely to take place.
Sure.
Even when the U.S. has recently begun trying to play a positive role in bringing peace in Ukraine, what the Secretary of Defense Hegseth said is we need to end the fighting in Ukraine so we can focus on the real enemy, and that's China.
Okay.
Now, focusing on Iran also is part of clearly U.S. foreign policy strategy.
Yeah, what Hegseth said was, if, quote, if war is what the U.S. wants, be it a tariff war, trade war, any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end. We are prepared. China actually said that. I'm sorry. Hegseth said, well, we're prepared. Those who long for peace must prepare for war. The U.S. was prepared to go to war with China. You made references, Peter, to some of the things in the past, such as PNAC that you mentioned, and the approach that the U.S. has had in terms of being an empire. We know the U.S. has a very big military, but I think the current landscape is a bit different. Since you have mentioned Iran, we're looking at an Iran that is using AI in its military, along with obviously the vast missile industry that it has, where you have had our commander of the IRGC saying that if we unveil a missile city in Iran every week from today, these unveilings will not end in 2 years. Now, let me ask you this. Saudi Arabia has just recently announced about $600 billion worth of investment with the U.S. Donald Trump has come out and said, I think we can up that to $1 trillion. And he said that this could obviously include arms and military arsenal. Why would the U.S. be so keen on selling Saudi Arabia so much in arms, unless there's a reason why Saudi Arabia should feel intimidated or by something? And I'm, as a guess, might leads me to Iranophobia, which is something that the U.S. has done. Do you agree?
Well, the U.S. intelligence was saying they expect Israel to strike Iran within the first 6 months of this year, 2025. We're already into March now. We know that Netanyahu has been wanting to get U.S. support for an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities for many, many years. Netanyahu's influence on Trump pulled the United States out of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which was working very, very effectively from the U.S. standpoint, and I think from Iran's standpoint also. But when Trump abrogated the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, that was a victory not only for the anti-Iran forces in the U.S., but also for the Israelis. Now, Saudi Arabia's role in all of this has been conflicted. Saudi Arabia, as we know, was very hostile to Iran, but there's been some rapprochement recently and improving of the relation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But Saudi Arabia is key to Trump's vision of the Abraham Accords, Trump's vision for remaking the Middle East with closer alliances between Saudi Arabia and Israel as part of it was a centerpiece of that deal. Saudis didn't go along with it, and they're even more resistant now because of what Israel is doing in Gaza. But Trump still holds out that vision and holds out that hope. And Saudi Arabia is a very wealthy country and has been closely aligned with the United States for most of its war history.
The confrontation between the Israeli regime and also Iran is something that not only has been talked about throughout the years and decades, but it actually came into fruition based on Operation True Promise 1 and 2, which is what we call it here in Iran.
We have to put it in the context. From the Israeli standpoint, Iran is in a much weakened position now with the attacks on and the weakening of Hezbollah, with the weakening of Hamas, with the change of government in Syria, and then plus the exchange of fire between Israel and Iran.
Sure.
Last year, Israel sees Iran as more vulnerable now, and we know that they would love to have a hit on the Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordow, among others.
Sure.
And they've got that vulnerability. And it was last month that the United States sold the guidance kits for the Israeli bunker buster bombs to Israel. That was Trump who did that. And that's what facilitated an attack on Iran's hardened and underground nuclear facilities.
Okay.
Now, Israel wants more support than that from the United States. Israel wants aerial refueling capabilities and intelligence capabilities. So we don't know where Trump's going to come out on this. Trump has been very hostile to Iran during his first administration, but this time he's gotten some of the Iran hawks like Pompeo and Bolton and Nikki Haley are not part of this administration. And so we don't know if Trump wants to cut a deal with Iran, and he says Iran's going to have to give up his entire nuclear program, but he might be looking for that kind of deal. We don't know that Iran would be willing to do that or that Trump would
Okay.
be willing to do. But Trump has made a lot of threats if that deal is not concluded.
Yeah, you talked about what's been some of the mainstream picture of what Iran has experienced in terms of some of the resistance groups being weakened. You talked about Hezbollah. You talked about you didn't talk about Hamas. You also talked about the fact that Israel, Israel's latest attack actually weakened Iran as well. But when we take a look at the actual details behind Operation True Promise 1 and 2, we can see the type of damage that Iran's missile capabilities incurred on Israel itself. At the same
Yes.
time, we could look at the resurgence that Hezbollah has had. Just 2 weeks ago, roughly, we had the unbelievable showing of the number of supporters that Hezbollah still carries. And of course, even though they have been weakened, maybe in terms of their missile capability, the production is back up and running. The question that I'm bringing about here is that if the weakened position that you have portrayed was to be true the way that you have said it, even though Iran's military capabilities have been on display for the past 2 months, then why would the U.S. president want Russia to come into the picture and mediate, even though we're not sure whether Russia volunteered or was asked? All indications are that this was discussed in that Riyadh meeting. What do you think of that?
Well, first of all, I was saying that that's the Israeli perception. I wasn't saying that's my perception.
Oh, okay.
Israelis view Iran is in a weakened position now. They feel like the attacks, while Iran did succeed in getting a lot of its missiles through Israeli air defenses, Israel feels that it has significantly weakened Iranian air defenses, and this would be a time of vulnerability for that attack to take place. The question of Russia's mediation there could be a game changer. Clearly, Trump has been trying to improve relations with Russia, has in some ways shifted sides in Ukraine from the position that the U.S. adopted under the Biden administration to a new position that is much more friendly to the Russian position. So Trump is actually seriously committed in improving U.S. relations with Russia. Russia has strengthened its ties and its alliance with Iran. Russia has called for peaceful resolution of these issues, not a military resolution. So that could be a game changer also, depending on if you could trust Trump. Now, Trump is mercurial, Trump is erratic, Trump is rash and impulsive, and Trump is very militaristic in certain ways. So, Trump could turn on a dime, but right now, Trump is talking about improving relations with Russia in a way that could certainly benefit ties with Iran.
Okay, well, it's quite telling when you have the U.S. siding with Russia against all the European allies, nearly all of them at the UN recently, in backing a resolution that called for a swift end to that war. That's something that's unprecedented, and I think that actually puts the whole notion of a new world order into another type of world order. We, as you said, we don't know the stability that Trump has in terms of his word, being true to his word. The way that Israel and Iran have confronted each other, where the attacks have taken place, needs to then have the whole nuclear issue opened up in terms of what the Israeli regime possesses. You've talked about a nuclear winter, and I remember during this one of your interviews, you said at the height of the Cold War, there was a meeting in 1961. Kennedy was present there, and Dean Rusk, then U.S. Secretary of State, if you recall that. And you said what was discussed was a secret preemptive strike to wipe out the Soviet Union. Oliver Stone jumped in and said China as well. Now my question is, you say that there are some military personnel in the U.S. who still think that way. Well, we have this situation between Iran and Israel. Israel has nuclear weapons, although undeclared, but we know that it does possess it. Shouldn't something be done in order for it to disarm?
Well, I would like to see all the nuclear countries disarm. I think we need to abolish nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. And Trump, to his credit, now let me make clear, I don't like Trump. I don't trust Trump. His domestic policy here is pure fascism in the United States. He's trying to destroy the programs for poor people and working people so he can give more tax breaks to the super wealthy, the Elon Musks. However, there are a couple of things in which I agree with Trump, and one of them is his call for dramatically reducing nuclear weapons in the United States, Russia, and China, moving toward abolishing nuclear weapons, I hope, would be the logical sense of that. That was not Trump during the first term in office. Trump during the first term in office was a nuclear hawk. And now at least he's talking about cutting military spending and cutting nuclear weapons. So that would be a good thing. And in that context, I would love to see Israel get rid of its nuclear weapons also.
Well, when you put that into that context, I'm going to go back to what the U.S. President Donald Trump has said, which I'm sure Netanyahu is very much satisfied with, where if you don't return the captives to the Palestinians, you are dead. In terms of Hamas, it's the last warning to you, release all the captives now, not later, or it is over for you. You know, that doesn't sound like there's going to be any type of, that doesn't sound like there will not be any type of relationship.
No, I agree with you. As terrible, as wise as Trump is when it comes to cutting nuclear weapons or looking for peace in Ukraine and improving relations with Russia, when it comes to the the Southwest Asia, as you call it, Trump is horrible. I mean, his position there is to give all the support possible and all the encouragement possible to the Netanyahu government and to try to strengthen Israeli position in the region. Well, so I think Trump is very, very dangerous when it comes to the Southwest Asia, and when it comes to Israel. His policy is in some ways even worse than Biden's was, and Biden's policy was nightmarish.
You know, with Trump, it's needless to say that he is all about business and in terms of profits. That is well known. You have talked about arms manufacturers being the ones who have made so much profits off of these wars. You referenced Biden, Victoria Nuland, Jake Sullivan. They have all said that this money goes back to the U.S. economy, which means, as you said, the pockets of arms manufacturers. And you said this is the highest form of immorality. Then what do you think about the massive arms shipments that the U.S. has provided Israel and continues to do so, being one of the largest recipients, especially when it comes to this genocidal war against the Palestinians and the Hamas fighters in the Gaza Strip?
We were calling for Biden to stop aid to Israel while this slaughter was going on in Gaza. Many Americans, that's what the protests were on the campuses in the United States. You know, this was, it became the burning moral issue for my students' generation. Part of the reason why Kamala Harris lost to Trump is because the younger generation was so outraged by U.S. support for Israel as the slaughter was taking place that they refused to come out and vote for Kamala Harris. And she refused to break with Israel. So now they've gotten Trump, who is even worse when it comes to Israel. So what the United States needs to do is rethink its entire policy when it comes to the region, because the United States is on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of morality.
Well, they have not only the U.S. Suggested through Donald Trump in terms of forcibly displacing Palestinians there, Peter. Also, based on the most recent piece of news, Donald Trump is thinking about applying what it wants to do with the Gaza Strip to the occupied West Bank, which would mean annexation and would mean permanent Israeli sovereignty. You know, so here we are, and not just the Gaza Strip, but the West Bank. Where these talks, I understand, have turned certain areas into a joint American-Israeli initiative, encouraging Palestinians to move to Egypt and Jordan. I mean, this is against international law, and the forcible displacement is not something that Palestinians are obviously going to opt for, not just the West Bank, even the ones in the Gaza Strip, you see those Palestinians are still there. They don't want to go, and you see what they are facing. So where does that leave Palestine?
It leaves Palestine caught between the United States and Israel on the one hand, and the rest of the world on the other. The Europeans have not gone along with U.S. Hawkishness in the region. The Gulf states have not gone along with it. Countries that are usually U.S. allies have been resisting this very, very horrific policy that the U.S. and Israel have been pushing in the region. You know, Jared Kushner talked about the beautiful beachfront properties in Gaza if we can only get rid of the Gazans and the Palestinians. And Trump has that vision also for his Trump Towers across Gaza. Well, and his hotels and his golf courses. This is sick. It's perverse. It's against the international law. It's against fundamental decency and morality. And it's, unconscionable what the U.S. and Israel have been doing in that region. So, even if one says that Israel's security should be guaranteed, so should the Palestinians' rights and freedoms and security be guaranteed. And this is not, and if we look at the October 7th attack, which I have denounced, and I don't support, I thought that many aspects of that were barbaric. It was because of Netanyahu. Hamas did not pose a serious threat to Israel. Israel had removed much of its troops from that region near Gaza to the West Bank because of the attacks by the settlers on the Palestinians in the West Bank. Netanyahu had divided Israel with his judicial reforms. Israel was a deeply divided country, and it was only because Israel was asleep. Israel had known for a year about the plans that were enacted on October 7th. Israel had seen them preparing for it right before the attack took place. And Netanyahu was so incompetent and so fixated on his own destructive policies inside Israel that he let down the defenses. So I don't see Hamas, I never saw Hamas as posing a serious threat, which is why Netanyahu had done everything he could to encourage Hamas, encourage Qatar to supply funds and backing to Hamas, because Netanyahu wanted to use Hamas to keep the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza divided from each other. So this is just the ineptitude, the incompetence, and the cynicism of Israeli policy that made this possible.
Well, when you say that in that respect, you sound very convinced that it's not just a theory, that you also gave examples. But the fact that Netanyahu wants to keep the Palestinian factions, such as the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, divided was for the sole purpose of not wanting a Palestinian state. Is that correct?
Yes.
If so, then I would assume then that by default the U.S. was aware of this. Then would it be a correct conclusion that the U.S. and Israel dragged peace talks? They were just dragging it in order for them to continue with taking over more Palestinian land, building more illegal settlements?
Well, the U.S. is divided on that. I mean, there are clearly a lot of Israel hawks in the United States. Israel exerts inordinate influence through AIPAC and other means on the U.S. Congress. However, there is also a lot of Americans, including foreign policy officials, who understand that a two-state solution, an enduring two-state solution in which Palestinian security is guaranteed, is the only way to ever get real peace and stability in the region. So I'd say that the U.S. foreign policy establishment was very divided on this, but Trump represents the extreme pro-Israel wing of the foreign policy establishment, but there are a lot of other voices as well.
Need to focus a little bit on Iran's nuclear file. You know, this has been something that the U.S. administration and Israeli regime and many others have come out and accused Iran of wanting to weaponize its civilian nuclear program. Yet this notion is time and again proven to be false throughout the years and decades practically. One of the reports that came out the end of last year, Iran not after building nuclear weapons, that was the U.S. intel community saying that it's not looking for building nuclear weapons based on the Wall Street Journal also reporting that, citing the U.S. intel community. And of course, Iran's leaders, they should have fought well against it. Peter, really, when it comes down to this, is this about Iran's civilian nuclear program, which Israel and the U.S. thinks that it's not? Or is this after trying to control Iran in terms of its military capabilities, such as its missiles?
Well, it's possible to be a little bit of both in this case. The JCPOA was working very, very effectively. Iran had shipped out 97% of its enriched uranium. Iran had mothballed many of its centrifuges. Iran was enriching up to 3.67%. And then the U.S. abrogated the JCPOA. And then all bets were off and all restraints were off. Iran has remained part of the NPT, which Israel and India and Pakistan are not part of. There were a lot of, the authorities came and investigated repeatedly in Iran, and they found that Iran was abiding by the nuclear deal. Now Iran has enriched up to 60%. You know that under the JCPOA, the experts were saying that it would take Iran a year to develop a nuclear weapon. Now with 60% enrichment, more advanced centrifuges, a large stockpile, the estimate now is that Iran has enough fissile material already for 6 bombs, 6 nuclear bombs, and that Iran could break out within weeks or months at the most. That doesn't mean it could deliver the weapon yet, but Iran has that capability. The CIA report was that Iran abandoned any effort to build a nuclear weapon back in 2003. So that was more than 20 years ago, according to the CIA. There is no evidence that Iran has intention now of developing a nuclear weapon.
I'd like to move beyond that topic at this point and look at the way that the U.S., through the President Donald Trump, has diverged from what we're seeing from the European Union. We saw what happened, obviously, at that briefing that took place with Zelensky and Vance and Trump, and how that debacle actually unfolded, which I'd like to get your idea on. But are we looking at the fact that this is something that is happening, where even Trump saying recently that the European Union was formed to screw the United States, where it's been called a pivot away from Europe towards Russia? Do you see it that way?
On the surface, that's clearly what's happening. Trump has been hostile to Europe. If we look at his tariff policy, it's been an attempt to punish Europe. He thinks that Europeans are freeloaders, that they've been able to raise their standards of living and provide such good benefits in terms of housing and healthcare and education, because the United States has been carrying the ball when it came to Europe's defense. Trump has a little mind. He doesn't see the big picture. He sees it in very transactional economic terms. He sees a trade deficit as hurting the United States, where in many ways it helped American consumers. So Trump's understanding of the world is very, very narrow. And in that context, he sees the Europeans as having taken advantage of the United States over the years, and NATO as being to the European advantage rather than to the American. So Trump is trying to change that. And he wants what he's calling for in terms of European countries spending 5% of their GDP on their militaries is a horrible idea. We should be cutting military spending all over the world so that we could raise the spending on social programs that people really need. But Trump wants to increase military spending around the world, make the world more dangerous, have Europe take responsibility for itself, which the hawks in Europe are happy to hear. What we hear coming out of all the European capitals, with a couple of exceptions, is that they want to increase their military spending. That's going backwards. That's not the direction the world needs to go right now. So, but yes, that shift is occurring. And it's a good idea for the United States and Russia to be getting along. It's a good idea for the United States and Russia to be working together. It's a good idea to peacefully and diplomatically resolve the conflict in Ukraine, which should never have happened and could have been avoided, could have been prevented, should have been prevented, but there was no statesmanship. And so we have a problem, is that we have Trump wanting to make America great again, Putin wanting to make Russia great again, Xi Jinping wanting to make China great again, Modi wanting to make India great again, instead of anybody speaking for the planet now. And if you're going to speak for the planet, you're not going to increase military spending. You're going to cut military spending and focus instead on the things people need, like dealing with global warming, dealing with the gap between rich and poor. We live in a planet which the richest 6 people have more wealth than the poorest 4 billion people. This is craziness. We're facing real health concerns around the world, poverty concerns, warfare. So we need to be having a very, very different approach than we have now, which is why I've been calling for a global summit of leaders to step back and figure out how to deal with the planet in a much more peaceful way.
All right, thank you very much. We unfortunately don't have any more time left, but I'd like to thank you, and I will say this properly this time, Peter Kuznick, a full professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University in Washington, D.C. It was a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that brings us to an end for this edition of Unscripted. We spoke to Peter Kuznick, and we found out a number of things about the U.S. foreign policy in terms of its approach, and of course through the U.S. President Donald Trump, and how some of his views on its approach towards things like Palestine perhaps is not the right way to go in terms of it breaking international law for one. It was great having you on board with us to watch this program. From me, Kaveh Tafli, it's goodbye.